Tides from the West, a Chinese autobiography, written by Jiang Monglin, read by Tang Daming.
Part 4. Unification. Chapter 17. An Experiment in Constitutionalism. During the warlord regime, one evening, the Soviet ambassador at Peking gave a banquet at the embassy to leading men of the city. About 60 people were present. When the roast suckling pigs were passed round the table, some of the guests looked at the steaming roast and burst into subdued giggles, while out of the corners of their eyes they glanced at the president and vice president of the National Assembly, who were among the guests. The contagious giggles spread until the whole table caught them except the two officials, who pulled long faces but remained calm. Finally, I saw somebody whisper in the ears of the Soviet ambassador, and he too succumbed to the contagion. The story was this. In the old days, when the Dutch Indies needed labor, owners of rubber plantations and mines resorted to getting laborers from China by fraudulent means. By painting a rosy picture of the prospects and offering a sum of money, labor agencies in China enticed workers to cross the sea to the islands, and there sold them to the development companies with or without the knowledge of the human goods. These unfortunate people were called pigs because they had been sold for money like the meanest livestock. During the early years of the Republic, the irregular practices of certain members of the National Assembly became so notorious and contemptible that people reminiscently called them pigs, since they were willing to sell themselves to the highest bidder. The great majority of members were upright men, but they were unorganized and therefore powerless to check their fellow members. They, too, were so unfortunate as to be tagged with the epithet. When bad men combine, the good must associate. If they do not, it is their own fault, and they have only themselves to blame. The idea of a written constitution for China had been introduced from America. The Constitution of the United States was an embodiment of ideas and beliefs of the American people and grew out of the life of the people. The Constitution of China was a copy of imported ideas, adopted according to the fancy of those who drafted the document and alien to the habits and ideas of the Chinese. During the imperial regime, in the last few years before the revolution, the provincial assemblies representing the gentry class achieved credible results because their main interests were more or less the same, and there was leadership in that class. The imperial governor of the province had enough prestige to serve as a check to the assembly. Little or no political squabbling went on in the assembly to obscure the larger issues. The bills passed were generally for the welfare of the people of the province. Little or no corruption was known. In 1912, when Dr. Sun Yat-sen was provisional president of the Republic at Nanjing, the National Assembly showed healthy signs of becoming a modern parliament, for its members represented revolutionary interests, and there were revolutionary leaders to guide it. Dr. Sun's prestige as chief executive was high. But when the assembly came under Yuan Shikai, trouble began to brew. This autocratic and reactionary president was hated by the revolutionary leaders, and the president hated them in turn. With a strong army in his hands, he resorted to intimidation, thus setting a very bad precedent for future development of the legislative body. To illustrate the ludicrously bad effect of this technique on the morale of the members, I may relate here an incident which occurred during Yuan's election to the presidency. Photographers covered the event. In those days, indoor picture-taking involved the use of flashlight powder, which exploded noisily with a dazzling light. On this occasion, taking it for a bomb explosion, people ran wildly for safety. one member ducked under a table, shouting, "I voted for Yuan Shikai!" Quite a few lost their slippers, Chinese masculine footgear is comfortably loose, and were obliged to look for them after the scare was over. The episode ended with the impeachment of the Secretary General for allowing photographers to frighten the assembly by a bomb. Under Yuan's presidency, the activity of the half-dozen political parties degenerated into mere political squabbling. Party and personal feelings ran high. The assembly, discredited in the eyes of the people, was finally washed away in the tides of Yuan's maneuvers for a monarchy and the restoration movement of Zhang Xun. These movements failed, however, and the National Assembly was restored. Political power was now divided among the military governors of the provinces, the shadowy central government in Peking having neither prestige nor power to control the assembly. Through corruption, Cao Kun, a northern warlord, got himself elected president, and the prestige of the national legislative body sank rapidly as subsequent developments led ever downward to new lows of political integrity. Quite a number of representatives were elected through corruption. Gu Hongming, a well-known cynical scholar of international fame, told me that during an election, he got $800 from a man who bought his vote. He took the money but did not go to the polls. Instead, he went to Tianjin and spent all the money there. Later, at an international party in the Grand Hôtel de Pékin, Gu got hold of the man and, pointing to him, said to the gathering, "This man wanted to buy me for $800. Gentlemen, do you think Gu Hongming is so cheap?" When undesirable elements came into the assembly in this manner, even though the number was not large, they naturally made it look like an auction house, representation being sold to the highest bidder. The students of Peking now directed their attack upon the House of Corruptions. One afternoon, several thousand boys and girls surrounded the assembly and demanded that a certain bill concerning educational measures be deleted from the agenda. There was a clash between the police on duty there and the student body. Some of the students became so incensed that a few days later they smuggled in 3 bombs from Tianjin intended for the assembly. They were persuaded not to carry out this violence, and the bombs were taken outside the city and thrown into a river. A few weeks later, a fisherman caught one of them and shook it in his hands to find out what was inside. Bang! The bomb went off and carried with it the hands and head of the inquisitive fisherman. Police assumed that it had been dropped there in the days of the revolution, and no investigation was made. Conflicts between the assembly and the students continued. The assembly members tried at first to assert their right as representatives of the people. The students retorted, calling them by their now familiar contemptible name. The assembly tried to impeach the chancellor of the National University of Peking. The students retaliated by staging mass demonstrations in which flags bearing the likeness of a pig streamed in the air amid threats to smash the assembly. Finally, the assembly, conscious of its weakness, declared the truce by letting the universities and students alone. Gu Hongming, whose cynical views made him contemptuous of students and representatives alike, said to me one day, "You believe in democracy, but to me, it is demo-crazy." If an institution is hated by the public, it may still have some grounds to exist. But when it is sniffed and mocked at, even though for the acts of a mere minority, the whole suffers from the inadequacy of the part and goes down together like a sinking boat. So it was with the assembly in the early phases of constitutional government in China. At length, some of the warlords snatched the opportunity to brush it aside as a scrap of paper. The story of constitutionalism in the days of the warlords had, of course, two sides to it. On the one hand, the warlords wrecked it by intimidation through force and by corruption with money. They had no prestige, no principle, and no policy by which to guide a democratic body. After Yuan Shikai, the power of the central government was a political shadow, the real power being divided among the provinces by the warring rulers who set themselves above the law. What they knew was the military strength of their feudal armies. The central government was not in the position to have any principle or policy. Fundamentally, it was worthy neither of support nor of opposition. On the other hand, most members of the assembly were little concerned with national interests. Their preoccupations were either provincial or local, or, still worse, personal. National interests they conceived only vaguely, and they themselves were therefore not in the position to have any coherent guiding principles or policy on national issues. Consequently, no leadership was possible except in matters of local or personal interest. The Chinese people loved freedom, but were inexperienced in organized democracy. In other words, in constitutionalism. They did not see the importance of it. For China to follow the constitutional pattern of the West without its background was to hitch China's wagon to the Western star. It was small wonder that the experiment failed miserably. With this failure before his eyes, Dr. Sun Yat-sen devised a system of tutelary government as a stepping stone to constitutional government in his plan for an organized democracy for China. According to this scheme, the period of national unification was to be followed by what might be called government in a state of tutelage, i.e., government by the Kuomintang, as a transition to the full-fledged constitutional form. And when the Kuomintang came to power in 1927, the tutelary government at Nanjing was indeed meant to offset the bad effects of the corrupt National Assembly, which had become a headache to the entire country. During the next 10 years, the Nationalist Party, under the leadership of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, dislodged many a local warlord from the provinces and achieved to a large extent the unification of the country. The danger to national existence brought upon China by the Japanese militarists further intensified the unification. Unification of the country was a necessary condition to constitutionalism. With respect for the law on the part of governing and governed alike, with the principles laid down by Dr. Sun Yat-sen, and with efficient leadership both in the government and in the National Assembly, China will be on the road to successful constitutionalism and organized democracy.
What you just heard is Tides from the West, a Chinese autobiography, written by Chiang Meng-lin, read by Tang Da-min, and published by the Foreign Language Teaching and Research Press. Some names and terminologies in this book have been updated per contemporary usages.